The ball, first part. The ball took place, all the perplexities of the previous Spiegulen day notwithstanding. I think that even if Lemke had died that same night, the ball would still have taken place in the morning, so much of some special significance did Yulia Mikhailovna collect with it. Alas, until the final moment she remained blind and did not understand the mood of society. No one toward the end believed that the great day would go by without some colossal adventure, without a denouement, as some put it, rubbing their hands in anticipation. Many, it is true, tried to assume a most frowning and political look. But generally speaking, the Russian man is boundlessly amused by any socially scandalous commotion. True, there was among us something rather more serious than the mere thirst for scandal. There was a general irritation, something unappeasably spiteful. It seemed everyone was terribly sick of everything. Some sort of general muddled cynicism had come to reign, a forced, as if strained cynicism. Only the ladies were not to be muddled, and that only on one point: their merciless hatred of Yulia Mikhailovna. In this all the ladies' tendencies converged, and she, poor woman, did not even suspect. Until the final hour she remained convinced that she was surrounded and still the subject of fanatical devotion. I have already hinted at the fact that various trashy sorts of people had appeared among us, always and everywhere in a troubled time of hesitation or transition. Various trashy sorts appear. I am not speaking of the so-called vanguard, who always rush ahead of everyone else, their chief concern, and whose goal, though very often quite stupid, is still more or less definite. No, I am speaking only of scum. This scum, which exists in every society, rises to the surface in any transitional time, and not only has no goal, but has not even the inkling of an idea, and itself merely expresses anxiety and impatience with all its might. And yet this scum, without knowing it, almost always falls under the command of that small group of the vanguard which acts with a definite goal, and which directs all this rabble wherever it pleases, provided it does not consist of perfect idiots itself, which incidentally also happens. It is said among us now, when everything is already over, that Peter Stepanovich was controlled by the Internationale, that Peter Stepanovich controlled Yulia Mikhailovna, and that she, at his command, directed all sorts of scum. Our most solid minds are now marveling at themselves. How could they suddenly have gone so amiss then? What our troubled time consisted of, and from what to what our transition was, I do not know, and no one, I think, knows, except perhaps certain visitors from outside. And yet the trashiest people suddenly gained predominance and began loudly criticizing all that's holy, whereas earlier they had not dared to open their mouths. And the foremost people, who until then had so happily kept the upper hand, suddenly began listening to them and became silent themselves. And some even chuckled along in a most disgraceful way, some sort of Lyamshins, Telyetnikovs, landowner Tintetnikovs, homegrown milksop Radishchevs, little Jews with mournful but haughty smiles, jolly passing travelers, poets with a tendency from the capital, poets who in place of a tendency and talent had peasant coats and tarred boots, majors and colonels who laughed at the meaninglessness of their rank and were ready for an extra ruble to take off their swords at once and slink away to become railroad clerks, generals defecting to the lawyers, developed dealers, developing little merchants, countless seminarians, women who embodied in themselves the women question. All this suddenly and fully gained the upper hand among us. And over whom? Over the club, over venerable dignitaries, over generals on wooden legs, over our most strict and inaccessible ladies' society. If even Varvara Petrovna, right up to the catastrophe with her boy, was all but running errands for all this scum, then some of our Minervas can be partially forgiven for their befuddlement at the time. Now everything is imputed, as I've already said, to the Internationale. The idea has grown so strong that even all the visiting outsiders have been informed along these lines. Just recently, Councillor Kubrikov, 62 years old and with a Stanislav round his neck, came without any summons and declared in a heartfelt voice that during the whole 3 months he had undoubtedly been under the influence of the Internationale. And when, with all due respect for his age and merits, he was asked to explain himself more satisfactorily, though unable to present any documents except that he, quote, felt it with all his senses, end of quote, he nevertheless stuck firmly to his declaration, so that he was not questioned further. I will repeat once again, among us there was also preserved the small group of prudent persons who had secluded themselves at the very beginning and even locked themselves in. But what lock can stand against the law of nature? In the same way, even in the most prudent families, young ladies grow up who have a need to go dancing. And so all these persons, too, ended up by subscribing for the governesses. And the ball promised to be so magnificent, boundless. Wonders were being told. Rumors spread about visiting princes with lorgnettes, about 10 ushers, all young cavaliers with bows on their left shoulders, about Petersburg movers of some sort, about Karmazinov consenting to augment the collection by reading Merci in the costume of a governess from our province, about the planned quadrille of literature, also all in costume, with each costume representing some tendency. Finally, also in costume, some sort of honest Russian thought would perform a dance, which in itself was a complete novelty. How could one not subscribe? Everyone subscribed. According to the program, the festive day was divided into 2 parts, the literary matinee from noon till 4, and then the ball from 9 o'clock on through the night. But this arrangement itself concealed germs of disorder. First, from the very beginning, a rumor established itself among the public about a luncheon right after the literary matinee, or even during it, with a break especially arranged for that purpose. A free luncheon, naturally, as part of the program, and with champagne. The enormous price of the ticket, 3 rubles, contributed to this rumor's taking root. Quote, because why should I subscribe for nothing? The ball's supposed to go on round the clock, so they'll have to feed us. People will get hungry. Thus the reasoning went. I must admit that it was Yulia Mikhailovna herself who planted this pernicious rumor through her own light-mindedness. About a month earlier, still under the initial enchantment of the grand design, she had babbled about her ball with whoever happened along and about the fact that toasts would be proposed. She had even sent a notice to one of the metropolitan newspapers. She had been seduced mainly by these toasts. Then she wanted to propose them herself and kept devising them in anticipation. They were to explain our chief banner. What banner? I bet the poor dear never devised anything. To be passed on in the form of reports to the metropolitan newspapers, to touch and charm the higher authorities, and then to go winging over all the provinces, arousing astonishment and imitation. But for toasts, champagne was necessary. And since one could not really drink champagne on an empty stomach, a luncheon of itself also became necessary. Later, when through her efforts a committee had been formed and they got down to business more seriously, it was proved to her at once and clearly that if one were dreaming of banquets, very little would be left for the governesses, even with the most abundant collection. The question thus presented 2 solutions. Either a Belshazzar's feast with toasts and about 90 rubles left for the governesses, or the realization of a significant collection, with the ball being, so to speak, only for form. The committee only wanted to give her a scare, however, and of course came up with a third solution, conciliatory and sensible, that is, quite a proper ball in all respects, only without champagne, and thus with quite a decent sum as a balance, much more than 90 rubles. But Yulia Mikhailovna did not agree. Her character despised the Philistine middle. She resolved, then and there, since the first idea was unfeasible, to rush immediately and entirely to the opposite extreme. That is, to realize a colossal collection that would be the envy of all the provinces. Quote, for the public must finally understand, she concluded her fiery committee speech, that the achievement of universal human goals is incomparably loftier than momentary physical pleasures, that the ball is essentially only a proclamation of the great idea, and therefore one must be content with the most economical little German ball solely as an allegory, since it's impossible to do without this obnoxious ball altogether. End of quote. So much did she suddenly hate it. But she was finally calmed down. It was then, for example, that they thought up and suggested the, quote, quadrille of literature, end of quote, and other aesthetic things to replace physical pleasures. It was then, too, that Karamazov finally agreed to read Merci. Until then he had only hemmed and hawed, and thereby annihilate even the very idea of food in the minds of our incontinent public. In this way, the ball was again becoming a most magnificent festivity, though no longer of the same sort. And so as not to go soaring off completely into the clouds, it was decided that at the beginning of the ball they would serve tea with lemon and little round cookies. Then orgeat and lemonade, and lastly even ice cream, but that was all. For those who always and everywhere inevitably feel hungry and above all thirsty, a special buffet would be opened at the far end of the suite of rooms, to be taken charge of by Prokoryach, the head cook at the club, who, though under strict supervision by the committee, would serve whatever anyone liked, but for a separate price. And to that end, a written announcement would be posted at the door of the reception hall that the buffet was outside the program. But for the matinee, they decided not to open the buffet at all, so as not to interfere with the reading, even though the buffet would be located 5 rooms away from the White Hall, in which Karamazov had consented to read Merci. Curiously, it seems this event, that is, the reading of Merci, was seen by the committee as being all too colossally significant, and even by the most practical people. As for the more poetical people, the wife of the Marshal of Nobility announced to Karamazov, for instance, that after the reading she would at once order a marble plaque to be fixed to the wall of her White Hall with an inscription in gold saying that on such and such a day and year, here on this spot, the great Russian and European writer, as he laid down his pen, read Merci, and thus for the first time bade farewell to the Russian public in the persons of the representatives of our town, and that everyone would be able to read this inscription at the ball, that is, only 5 hours after Merci was read. I know for certain that it was chiefly Karamazov who demanded that there be no buffet at the matinee while he was reading, on any account whatsoever, despite the remarks of some committee members that this was not quite our way of doing things.